Welcome to this side event of the Sporting Chance Forum 2021, brought to you by the Center for Sport and Human Rights. One of the panels at this forum focuses on sex and gender in sports policy. You can see this session live on the 4th of October at 4 p.m. Geneva time, or at any time after the event using our online portal. For the panel itself, we're in the very capable hands of Madeleine Pape from the University of Lausanne. She's joined by Andreas Graf of FIFA, Magali Markowitz of the IOC, Kelekai Kayalo of the UN Human Rights Office, and Veronica Ivy, a trans athlete and human rights advocate. From all the sports bodies who are grappling with the issue of gender, we selected to hear from FIFA and the IOC because they've either made a statutory commitment to respect human rights, in the case of FIFA, or they've launched a strategic process to look to incorporate human rights, in the case of the IOC. In looking at the issue of gender in sport, we're not trying to say what the answers are. Rather, it's to note that historically, this conversation has been had without a human rights-based approach. But now the Human Rights Council at the UN is writing reports about it. The Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights is engaged. So why has there been a mobilization from these actors around this issue? Because, although policies perhaps have been well-intentioned, harms have occurred. And when that happens, we have to examine why and look at how processes can be improved. So our approach is to be informative and educational for people who want to understand how to look at the issue of gender through a human rights lens, or using a human rights-based approach. And part of that is to ensure that the voices of those affected are heard. In an issue as complex as this one, that almost certainly means institutions will be hearing things that will challenge them. We also have to bear in mind how harmfully polarizing this topic has become, and to think about the right format for conversations to take place safely, particularly where there are power dynamics that are relevant or where there's a risk of re-traumatizing survivors of abuse. For that reason, we convened 2 side events that support the main panel discussion in order to listen to 2 groups of athletes directly affected by regulations in sport around sex and gender. These are sessions firstly on transgender athletes with our friends at Athlete Ally, and secondly on athletes with variations in sex characteristics with an expert who has worked closely with many athletes, Dr. Payoshni Mitra. These side events are intended to provide more context and specifically demonstrate the complexity of the issues at play and the lived experiences of those who have suffered harm through their involvement in sport. On that basis, let's dive into these sessions.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the side event of the Sporting Chance Forum 2021, brought to you by the Center for Sport and Human Rights in partnership with Athlete Ally. My name is Ann Lieberman. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy and Programs for Athlete Ally. I'm currently on the unceded homeland of the Lenape people, also known as Brooklyn, New York. Athlete Ally is an international nonprofit working to dismantle the structures of oppression that isolate, exclude, and endanger LGBTQI+ people in sport. At a time when transgender athletes are under attack simply for existing, we have an opportunity today to hear from a group of absolutely incredible athletes about their experiences competing at the highest levels of their sport. I also want to note that no one community is a monolith, and trans people and trans athletes are a diverse group. We're lucky to have a range of experience and perspectives within this group of athletes, but I also want to acknowledge that we are still missing a variety of perspectives from trans athletes globally. I really hope that this conversation today will be the first of many centered on and led by trans and non-binary athletes. So with that, I would love to start by going around this virtual room. So if everybody could introduce themselves, name, pronouns, country, sport, and what you'd like to highlight in your journey as an athlete. And Ricardo, why don't we start with you?
Muchas gracias, Ann. Muy buen día a todas y a todos ustedes. Para mí es un placer y un honor estar compartiendo este panel con estos grandes amigos y grandes defensores y luchadores por los derechos de la comunidad trans en el deporte. Bueno, mi nombre es Ricardo del Real, me pueden decir Ricky. Yo soy de la Ciudad de México, radico en México también. Y bueno, yo soy olímpico de taekwondo. Estuve compitiendo en los Juegos Olímpicos de Sydney 2000, anteriormente como Mónica del Real, en donde quedé en un noveno lugar, pero anteriormente tuve algunos muy buenos resultados, como tener medalla de oro en una Copa del Mundo, la primera en la historia de mi país en el deporte femenil, y a su vez también 3 veces ser el mejor de América, como de Centroamérica, y también en campeonatos del mundo estar en 5, ganando 3 medallas de bronce. Culmino mi carrera en los Juegos Olímpicos de Sydney 2000 y actualmente, bueno, pues soy miembro permanente del Comité Olímpico Mexicano y a su vez actualmente estudio en la universidad, estoy estudiando Ciencias de la Comunicación, del cual me encanta y estoy enamorado, pero también soy embajador de un programa importante del Comité Olímpico Internacional que se llama Power Up, que esto es darle herramientas a los atletas de cómo enfrentar su vida laboral después del retiro. Y mi labor es estar en América Latina, dándole estas herramientas con un equipo de compañeros y compañeras que también han sido olímpicos y están como educadores maestros. Y bueno, pues para mí soy un hombre trans hace 4 años, así es que yo encantado de compartir mis experiencias con ustedes. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Ricky. Thank you for being here. All right, next I see Patricio.
Hey everyone, my name is Patricio Pat Manuel. I'm also known as Cacahuate or Peanut in the boxing world, which clearly means my sport is boxing. I'm coming to you from Tongvaland. I'm born and raised in what is now known as Los Angeles, California, the United States. Been involved in boxing for now going on 20 years of my life. I've dedicated literally all my, beyond my teenage years and more into this sport. I was a 5-time national amateur female champion, and it was actually during the first ever women's boxing Olympic trials that I suffered a medical disqualification due to a shoulder injury. And it was during that time that, like many athletes, I went into really deep depression, and I had to really look at who I was as a person beyond just being an athlete. And I realized that I needed to return to a truth I have known since I was a child, that I am a man, that I was born a boy who was going to grow up into a man, and it was society who got it wrong, not me. And I realized that I could no longer live that false identity that society had given me that I did not consent to. So in 2013, I decided to medically transition. And for me to live my life as the man that I always saw myself to be meant that I still would be involved in boxing. And it took until it was 2016 before I came back in the male division in the amateur with a win. And then in 2018, I became the first professional male boxer who is transgender to fought under a Golden Boy Promotions card. And I am the first to have won as well. So I really hope that, my journey can just continue to open doors for everyone, regardless of what their gender identity and regardless of what it is they want to do in life, that you do not have to seek permission to be yourself.
Thank you so much, Patricio. All right, next I see Veronica.
I'm Dr. Veronica Ivy. I have a PhD in philosophy. And I'm a trans woman. I've been competing since about age 10, primarily in badminton and golf. And it wasn't until a few years after my transition, when I took up a professor position in the state of South Carolina in the US, that I started cycling. And cycling has been my sport since then. And in 2018, and then again in 2019, I'm a 2-time UCI Masters track cycling world champion in the sprint event. Those are the jerseys you see behind me. So I focus entirely on track sprinting now, even though before that it was road cycling. I compete both at the Masters level, at the World Championships, and also at the UCI elite level throughout the season. Although I, have not been to the World Championships or the Olympics, and I likely will never be. I research and speak about and publish a number of articles about trans athlete rights and the forms of harassment that trans athletes face. And it's this sort of athlete, activist, and academic perspective that I bring to this panel. Oh, and I'm Canadian, if I haven't said that.
Thank you, Veronica. And Chris.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Mosier. My pronouns are he and him. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of Three Fires, also known as Chicago, Illinois. And I am a multi-sport athlete. I started competing in duathlon and triathlon prior to transition in 2009. In 2010, could no longer hide my truth and decided to transition both in life and in sport and started to compete in the men's category. In 2015, I became the first transgender man to make a men's national team in duathlon, and am now a 6-time member of Team USA in duathlon and triathlon, and a 2-time national champion in race walking. And in January of 2020, became the first trans man to compete in a men's Olympic trials in the 50K race walk. In addition to that, have dedicated now my life to creating more access and spaces for trans people and non-binary people to participate in sport, to fully be themselves, and to know that they don't have to give up any part of who they are to pursue what they love.
Thank you so much, Chris. I knew that this was an impressive panel when we put it together, but hearing all of you just give those intros, again, thank you so much for being here. So we have a lot to talk about and we have a short period of time, so we're going to jump right in. So the first question I have is going to be for all of you, and we'll go in reverse order. So Chris, Veronica, Patricio, and then Ricky. I'm going to try to keep this in line, y'all. How has being an out trans athlete affected or impacted your career opportunities?
So I think initially being out as a trans man was detrimental to my career in so much as I couldn't get a coach to agree to coach me. I had been told by sponsors that they couldn't have someone like me representing their company or brand in sports, while all of my teammates were able to be a part of a campaign. And I felt a lot of negativity coming towards me in the early part of my transition, particularly from 2010 to 2013. And I think it's important to note those dates because I do believe a lot has changed in the way that trans athletes are seen in sport. But after a certain point, and I think it was really in making Team USA in 2015, in challenging the International Olympic Committee policy in 2015, which resulted in update to the guidelines, that was really a moment that kickstarted my visibility and my platform as a trans athlete to be able to use sport as a way to speak about trans rights, about trans inclusion, and just provide more general education to folks about who transgender people are and that we love sport like everybody else. So initially, I thought that it was a detriment because every single article that came out about me, whether it was about my identity or not, to just be about sport, really was highlighting and elevating my trans identity more than it was talking about me as an athlete. And as somebody who is competitive, who trains hard, who takes a lot of pride in my performance and my output, I thought that it was really reductionist to just reduce me to that part of my identity. But at a certain point, I think it was around 2015, I saw a great opportunity to use this as a platform to provide hope and inspiration and aspirational messages to people who are like me, to people who didn't see people like themselves in sport, just as I didn't see people like me in sport when I was younger. And so now I think that being trans has been a benefit to me in so much as I, use this opportunity through sport to talk about the things that are important to me about human rights, about access and opportunity, and about the human dignity of transgender and non-binary people. So I feel conflicted about it, but overall, I'm really thrilled with the way that I've been able to own the power of my identity and use that for what I consider good for all.
Thank you, Chris. Veronica.
Yeah, it's That's a hard question to get into. I mean, it's a very emotional question. I think it's hard enough to just exist as a trans person with broadly and specifically transphobic societies around the world, and then to be a visibly out successful trans woman athlete is really next to impossible. So I won these world championships despite being trans, not because I'm trans. A lot of I've received a lot of negative press. I am a darling of the right-wing reactionary press, who love to use the wrong name for me, the wrong pronouns for me, to call me a man, to call me a cheater, even though I've been under very strict scrutiny and followed all the rules, and I've passed all anti-doping tests with flying colors. And I receive hate mail and death threats. I have stalkers. It has led me to develop PTSD and an anxiety disorder that makes training, let alone competing, extremely difficult for me. It has very specifically negatively impacted my performances. Once upon a time, we had a plan and a pathway to make the Tokyo Olympic team for Canada, and the negative response to my 2018 Masters World Championship, and all the death threats and the developing PTSD, made that just an impossibility. So it has really, really negatively impacted me personally and professionally. Certainly, there are lots of sponsors who will not touch a trans woman athlete, even a very successful one who is competing on the world stage. Of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't sponsors who won't work with me, and I love my sponsors very much. But in terms of the cash sponsors, they are effectively non-existent for trans women athletes. Yeah, so one thing I want to make very clear is some people like to make the claim that, well, I wasn't a successful cyclist before transition and I only found success after, but I did not compete in cycling pre-transition. Also, my world championships are in age group categories, so age 35 to 39, and I transitioned at age 29. So a 29-year-old is not going to compete in a 35 plus age category event. So this idea that I only found success because of my transition gets all of the facts wrong. And no trans athlete transitions for sport benefit. It is a personal decision, and it almost always comes at a cost of our performance. And that has certainly been the case for me.
Thank you, Veronica, for sharing that. Patricio.
Yeah, I mean, there's things I'm just thinking about what Veronica just said. Like, this is a heavy emotional question. I don't think that there's, and I normally don't like to say blanket statements, but I feel safe in saying this. I don't know of any trans athlete I have spoken to or had the pleasure of hearing their story that has not talked about how this negatively impacts you as an athlete. Like, just speaking as an athlete, even if it leads to an understanding and a deeper relationship with yourself, there's a consequence. I don't think people really understand when people make the choice to live their truth, they are moving into this knowing that there will be consequences. We do not live in a world that likes trans people, that tolerates trans people, let alone loves trans people or celebrates trans people. So even as I've had a lot of positive press, like they've definitely had positive press. Literally last week, I had a local religious figure track down my home address and send a letter address to my den name. These are things I'm even having to navigate. People, death threats, these things are common, and they're not just me. Like, this isn't like, oh, I'm just feeling this. This is a community experience. And especially when you're elevated into any form of visibility, people feel really attacked. And if you win on top of that, then they get really mad. It's either I'm going to get destroyed, which, I've been consistently sparring. I just came from sparring a undefeated pro before I came here. I look fine. I did fine. I consistently do this. Or I'm cheating, right? Like, then they're like, oh, you're roided to the gills, with absolutely no understanding of not only human physiology or the fact, like, we're tested. We're all tested more than cisgender athletes. is. Like, there is no way to slip anything in this. You know, I'd also say the trans experience is rejection, knowing that when I say who I am, that there is a possibility that not only can someone harm me, but at the very least, they may walk away from me, that they will no longer be a part of my life. And I lost that. I lost my coach, who I was incredibly close to, that during the Olympic trials, when he decided to pull me out to my shoulder, I told the press it wasn't worth, a gold medal wasn't worth damaging our relationship. This is a man then who turned his back on me when I decided to live my truth, and my whole gym turned their back. Like, these are the consequences. These are the negative consequences of it. I also barely been able to fight. Boxing's a different sport than other places. You cannot mandatory make someone compete against you. And the fact is, I'm good. I'm good at this. I'm a dangerous threat. If I was easy, someone would have fought me by now. More people would have fought me, because then they would have been like, that's fine. Thing is, I have over 70 amateur bouts against some of the best female boxers in the world. I have great coaches with me. Someone knows that I can go in there and I can throw just like anyone else, and that makes me dangerous. I will say on the plus side, though, looking at things in terms of opportunities, I was a gender nonconforming, mixed race, Black, female athlete. No one was knocking on my door, including the press and including the LGBTQ press. No one was concerned about when I was struggling financially to get to the Olympic trials. No one was wondering about what I was doing. Suddenly, now that I'm trans, I've gotten interest for a lot more people than before. So I would say, oddly, there are some opportunities that come to me because no one cared about me because I was gender nonconforming. And now suddenly people are interested in the trans angle. Though I will say this has not brought any sort of financial opportunities to me. Press does not equal money. Neither do all sponsorship opportunities equal into financial gain as well. You know, this has been difficult, but I would say at the end of the day, the best thing I got from this is going into my pro debut. I got hurt in the second round. I sat down in the corner and I knew I had to listen to my coach, and I was able to let go of every single expectations, knowing that even some people in my own community didn't think it was possible for me to win and just wanted to see me compete. The fact that I know that I can rise above any sort of pressure, that's the unfair advantage I have. And I would say that trans people have in general is like, we know, we can see, we are willing to at all costs center ourselves and continue pushing forward. That makes you unbreakable. And to me, like, I would never trade anything in the world to know that regardless of the consequences that can come at me, no matter what's thrown at me, I will always choose myself. I will 100% always make that choice to be myself and know that I can rise above.
Oof. Anyone else need a tissue? Thank you. Thank you for that. Ricky, we're going to go to you, and then I know that Veronica wants to add something as well.
Perfecto.
So go for it.
No, hombre, claro que sí. Bien, escuchando las historias de mis colegas panelistas, tremendas historias de vida. En mi caso, yo soy más viejito. Yo estuve compitiendo en la década de los 90. En ese entonces, no había tanta información referente a que podía ser posible transicionar como hombre. Yo me di cuenta que era un niño desde los 4 años de edad, cuando tenía un poco más uso de razón. Sin embargo, en mi país, como en casi la mayoría de los países latinos y quizás en algunos otros países del mundo que son como más conservadores, era imposible hablar del tema, ¿no? Era algo que pareciera una idea, a lo mejor es una idea de niños, pero pues de pronto te aprendes a aceptarte tal y como eres y decir, bueno, tengo del cascarón como la sociedad me ve, como una niña, pero yo siempre me sentí Ricky desde niño. Yo creo que en mi caso es como quizás lo que más existe ahorita en el movimiento internacional deportivo, de que hay mucha gente que somos transgénero, pero no nos atrevemos a dar este paso precisamente por ese temor del rechazo a la sociedad y preferimos mejor mantenernos en esta línea. Quizás como yo terminé mi carrera en el año 2000 y ya cuando me llega la información hasta el 2017 fue cuando entonces tomé esa gran decisión a consecuencia y a sabiendas de que podría ser, señalado, rechazado, y más porque yo me muevo en una esfera de lo que es la dirección del alto rendimiento, Comité Olímpico Mexicano, Ministerio del Deporte de México, no sabría yo realmente si iba a tener esa respuesta, pero a lo que voy con mi punto, ¿qué se siente ser atleta trans? Yo siempre lo supe para mí, era un trans prácticamente de closet, como lo llamamos en la comunidad. Y vaya que de pronto me festejaba mucho, pero era un festejo de grito interno, sin poderlo gritar al mundo, para poderlo festejar como debe de ser, ¿no? Como una persona libre de saber quién es y cómo me identificaba. Entonces, vuelvo a repetir, a mí la información me llegó ya muy tarde y la pregunta que me hacen de pronto, ¿qué hubiera pasado si hubieras tenido tú esa información recién tú comenzabas a estudiar taekwondo a los 9 años? Bueno, sin duda, y si se tenía esa información, yo hubiera transicionado en ese momento. Y creo que es por eso que nuestras voces deben de ser escuchadas para que efectivamente no haya esa discriminación, comenzando con las familias, los senos familiares, que desde ahí comienza el rechazo tremendo para todas las personas que nos atrevemos a ser diferentes y queremos triunfar en la vida. Así es que, vaya, tuve muchos logros importantes para mi país, sí, me sentí muy orgulloso, sí, no me avergüenzo de mi pasado, no. Lo que hago ahora es que de hace 4 años para atrás, pues era Mónica y todo lo que hizo lo hizo Mónica, pero de hace 4 años para acá, todo lo que está haciendo es Ricardo y simplemente los recuerdos y todo lo que sudé y todo lo que bajé de peso, todo lo que gané, perdí, claro que también lo digo, soy olímpico y orgullosamente olímpico. Y eso, pues una vez olímpico, siempre serás olímpico, sea como sea. Soy una persona que también contribuyo para el deporte internacional.
Thank you so much for that, Ricky. And I know Veronica wanted to add one more thing before we move on to the next question.
Yeah, I forgot to say, like, within sport itself, the level of harassment that I've faced. I was receiving hate messages literally from my second race in cycling. And basically, ever since then, there was a very coordinated campaign locally, regionally, nationally, and now internationally to have me banned from the sport. Both in violation of all the current policies. So I meet all the policies to compete as the woman that I am. I am medically and legally female as well, that they tried to have me banned. And when the sports authorities would not ban me, then they started lying about me. They wanted me tested for testosterone, even though my body doesn't produce any. They claimed that I was racing dirty, even though I had video evidence to the contrary. And they even got caught lying one time with no consequences whatsoever. I was at Masters Worlds one year, and while I'm racing, people were emailing the race director to have me kicked out of the competition. And then people have been petitioning national and the UCI, the International Federation, to ban me altogether just because I'm a visible and successful trans woman, regardless of my biology. So this level of campaigns of harassment and exclusion are another thing that we have to put up with just because we have the temerity to be successful.
Thank you for that, Veronica. And at the top of this question, you said, you took a deep breath and you said, this is a very emotional question. And each and every one of you on this panel is doing a significant amount of emotional labor to talk about these experiences, both positive and negative, and also very scary that you've experienced being out trans athletes. And so I want to say that and acknowledge that, because I want folks who are watching this panel to understand the emotional toll that it takes on athletes, but also when we ask folks to share their stories and experiences, it's not that simple. And so, I've spoken with many of you individually, and I think some folks, we've had this conversation collectively, but, often after a panel like this or doing a training or something, there's a high level of exhaustion or fatigue, especially for those of us who aren't, extroverted. So I just want to acknowledge that, because I think that's another level of what often doesn't get spoken about in panel conversations like this is the actual like emotional labor it takes to get to this point, to have this conversation. So, and again, to just thank you all and really acknowledge the heavy lifting that you're doing, so folks can really learn and understand more about the experiences of trans athletes competing at the highest levels of your sport. So this next question, Veronica, is for you specifically, and you started to talk about this already in terms of the policies, but so what are some of the policy conditions that you have to satisfy in order to compete, and do these policies create any barriers to participation for you, for other trans women? Like what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, it's quite a confusing patchwork, really, because prior to moving back to Canada, I was racing in the United States, and the United States, so USAC, United States Association of Cycling, didn't actually have a trans policy for a number of years, so they just sort of defaulted to the IOC recommendation. And so I started competing prior to the 2015 recommendation. So I happened to meet the 2003 recommendation, which required genital surgery and then a period of non-competition. And then 2015, the IOC recommendation was updated to remove the surgery requirement and then just institute a testosterone limit of 10 nanomoles per liter. And so now that I raced under the IOC, or sorry, the UCI, USA Cycling and Cycling Canada, the IOC policy, or the UCI policy, was the 10 nanomole policy, the IOC one. But I think in October 2019, while I was actually at the Masters World Championships in the UK, the UCI decided to adopt a 5 nanomole policy. And I have it on fairly good authority that that was done at least in part due to my presence at that level, because people and a lot of news reporting about me has speculated about the status of my genitals, like what genitals I have, because they're under the mistaken impression that genitals play sports, and they don't. So they were under the mistaken impression about the status of my genitals and therefore the status of my testosterone. But I've said many times that I have not produced testosterone in my body for about 10 years now. So it hasn't been difficult for me because the medical decisions I made were for me. They were not for the purposes of sport. It just so happened that the medical choices that I made it so that it was very easy for me to meet the medical requirements to compete as a trans woman in cycling. However, I think it is absolutely abhorrent and a violation of human rights, a violation of bodily autonomy to require athletes to undergo any sort of medical procedure as an eligibility criteria for competition. Sport is a human right, and so is bodily autonomy. And we have to remember that while it is true that many trans women will want to go through a medical transition such that they would easily meet whatever trans policy you would have, such as the current IOC recommendation, that is not true for all trans women. Also, that there's an issue of access and of equity. So in places like the United States, healthcare is not free. It is very, very expensive. And so it becomes an economic access issue for people where even if they want to undertake a medical transition, they might not have the financial resources to do it. Or even in the United States, but globally, especially in more conservative countries, more repressive countries, a trans athlete will not be able to find a doctor even willing to treat them or prescribe the sorts of medications or procedures that would satisfy these eligibility criteria. So I think it's an issue of global justice that we should not have required medical interventions as a criteria for participation in sport, which the IOC literally says is a human right in its fundamental principles of Olympism. So while the policies have not been a barrier for me, they are a barrier for other people, and that is a problem.
Thank you for that, Veronica. And I think the other piece that I'm hearing come through very, very clearly is this emphasis on trans people's bodies and incredibly invasive language around what the choices that people make in bodily autonomy cannot be the only focus, that we also have to be thinking about elements of social transition and what that means for athletes as well, and how we can support athletes in general, and not this hyper focus and this medicalization and pathologization of trans athletes, which we've seen for trans folks, for non-binary folks, for folks with intersex variations throughout the history of sport. All right, Patricio, my next question is for you. So how has your experience as a Black transgender athlete been different, especially in the US, from the experience of white cisgender athletes with regards to discrimination, opportunities, financial support, or any other ways? And I think we've talked about this a little bit, but the sport of boxing as well, and folks' in impression of boxing versus other sports, I would love if you could touch upon that as well.
Yeah, so I would even argue that it's beyond just the different experience from white cisgender athletes, and I would say white, trans, and non-Black athletes as well. You know, we live in a world that is still incredibly anti-Black. My experience is coming from the United States in particular as a mixed race person, but there is a one drop rule. And in particular, when you look Black, you are Black. I am not half white. I am Irish and African descent, but I am Black because this is how I'm labeled in this society. And, you know, it impacts everything. It literally impacts everything. There's not a part of life that is not infused with anti-Blackness. You know, I would argue transphobia is an extension. No, it's not, I don't argue it. It is. Transphobia is an extension of white supremacy, and in particular of the same type of policies that kidnapped my relatives and forced them and held them hostage here and forced them to build this country. This is so ingrained and impacts every opportunity I've had. In particular, like as Black trans people, we do experience everything more, like poverty, homelessness. And the task force, the LGBTQ task force found that 41% of Black trans people experience homelessness at one point in their life. This is 5 times more than general population. And in terms of income, which I've definitely experienced, 34% of Black trans people make $10,000 a year or less. I have definitely experienced this, especially as an athlete who comes from a poor sport. We also experience unemployment at 26% rate, which is 2 times higher than the trans general population and 4 times higher than the general population. I basically got to work for myself, otherwise I'm not making any money. And in particular, the way this bleeds into my sport, and also is one of the ways why I'm also embraced in my sport, is like boxing is a sport of marginalized identities. It is the sport of the oppressed. And I am very, very proud of the lineage that I come from in boxing. And it was one of the main appeals of the sport, other than that I like to fight and I don't want to get in trouble. But as someone who was raised by my white family, being in boxing and being in Black community and really finding out boxing has served as a place for Black men to say, I am a man. And this is a lineage I am carrying as well. Even if I do not have the accomplishments of Joe Gans, who is, and you know, I always have to bring him up because everyone loves to leave him off. He was the first African-American champion. He was a lightweight. Then 6 years later, Jack Johnson. Then we have Joe Louis. Then you have Muhammad Ali, of course. Even though there were other Black heavyweight champions after that. Like, this sport has been one of the few opportunities for us to stand up and claim our humanity and also point out all the inequities that we experience, whether it's, like I said, jobs, like Veronica said, access to even having hormones and transition care, knowing that even when we do go into hospitals, we will be experienced, or our experience will be different. We are more likely to die. That was definitely a fear for many of us who are Black and trans during COVID, was a concern. If we went into a hospital, the chances of any of us coming out were much lower than other people. And that's why sports is so important. And that's why I'm so angry that there are so many barriers to keep people out of this, because as Black people, this has been the first place in this country where we've been able to stake our claim and say, you have to pay attention to us. You have to listen to us. You cannot turn away. And as much as you want to say, oh, just dribble, do these things, we're in control here. The Black athlete has agency in sports, and to rob trans athletes, Black trans athletes, the opportunity to be in a place that is actually safe for us, that is safe and is sacred and is historically rooted in our revolution and our agency. To me, it's criminal, and it's another continuing extension of the terror of white supremacy on Black people.
Thank you so much for that, Patricio. Hard does not ask follow-up questions, but I'm gonna keep on going. Ricardo, this next question is for you. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work with with Mexico's Olympic Committee to further inclusion for trans athletes, and in the Mexican mainstream media to improve Mexico's understanding of transgender athletes and transgender people?
Gracias, San. Bien, me gustaría, antes de comenzar mi intervención referente al trabajo que se ha hecho, debo de comentar que hago un llamado a nivel internacional a todos los gobiernos, ¿no? A todos los presidentes de federaciones, de comités olímpicos nacionales, etcétera. ¿Por qué? Porque cuando nosotros decidimos transicionar, pues también viene el tema legal, y nos convertimos de pronto en ilegales en nuestro propio país, porque a veces los gobiernos no nos dan las facilidades para cambiar nuestros nombres, nuestras actas de nacimiento, y a su vez tener nuestros pasaportes y todo eso. De pronto es un calvario poder llegar y tenerlo. Cuando ya lo tienes, bueno, pues recurres a las demandas, recurres a todo el tema legal con abogados y todo, pero la pregunta es ¿por qué a mí no y a los demás sí? Esa es la pregunta. ¿Y por qué llego con esto? Porque cuando yo hago mi transición, yo entré como miembro permanente en el Comité Olímpico Mexicano desde el 2002, como Veronica del Real, ¿no? Perfectamente bien, sin ningún problema. Pero cuando yo ya hago mi transición y tengo mi acta de nacimiento, le estaba pidiendo precisamente al presidente del Comité Olímpico Mexicano que a partir de este momento ya cambiaba mi correo electrónico y cambiaba mi nombre, y aquí le enseñaba mi acta de nacimiento. Inclusive la World Olympian Association empezó una campaña en donde emitían un certificado donde te reconocían como olímpico, y en mi caso yo expuse mi situación y ellos me enviaron mi certificado con el nombre de Ricardo del Real Oli. Se lo muestro al señor presidente y pues no lo entendió. Dice, no, pero ¿cómo? No entiendo, ¿no? Pues lo tengo que platicar con el comité ejecutivo. Me daba largas, yo lo que quería es que necesitaba un documento de parte del Comité Olímpico para poder sacar mi pasaporte como un apoyo, para poder hacer mi trabajo a nivel internacional, porque como bien dicen mis compañeras y compañeros, pues tenemos que generar dinero, si no, ¿de qué vives? De amor no se vive, ¿no? Entonces, me estuvo dando muchas largas el presidente, ¿no? De tal suerte que ya iba a poner mi caso a la asamblea para ver si yo continuaba dentro como miembro permanente, porque ¿quién es Ricardo del Real? Mónica sí sabemos quién es, pero Ricardo del Real, ¿quién es? Y a esas me puso en esa disyuntiva, y yo simplemente le contesté, perdón, con todo respeto, señor presidente, pero el derecho humano no se pone a consideración de nadie. Y simplemente se quedó así. Claro que hubo denuncias, tuve que acudir con el Comité Olímpico Internacional denunciándolo por discriminación hacia mi persona, porque soy miembro de esta junta. Tuve que incurrir a unos consejos mexicanos donde hay defensa para la gente que sufre discriminación, y fue gracias a eso que después él accedió a aceptar a que yo continuara dentro del Comité Olímpico Mexicano como miembro permanente. ¿Cuál ha sido mi trabajo? Pues he querido hacer mucho, pero el Señor no deja hacer nada. Simplemente mi presencia está ahí, pero yo contribuyo otra vez con el Comité Olímpico Mexicano, perdón, Internacional, del programa que yo les estoy comentando. Ellos en ese departamento específicamente me apoyaron desde un principio que yo les comenté que iba a empezar mi transición y respetaron y dijeron, tú eres valioso para nosotros y por supuesto que te vamos a apoyar. Así es que tuve mucho más problemas en mi país con mis autoridades mexicanas deportivas a que pudieran aceptarme y a representarme, porque ya me conocían, me tenía que volver a presentar ahora con mi nueva identidad, con toda la que es los presidentes de federaciones y presidentes de diferentes partes que tenga que ver con el deporte mexicano. Entendemos a nosotros los trans, porque por si piensan que esto es un juego, ¿verdad? Que estamos jugando a que vamos a cambiar a ser hombre o a cambiar a ser mujer, pues no es un juego, es realmente todo un proceso en donde se violan derechos humanos, en donde se violan derechos donde nosotros tenemos toda la oportunidad de generar, toda la oportunidad de trabajar y obstaculizan totalmente esto. El deporte no es para toda la vida, señoras y señores. El deporte es tan solo un fragmento de nuestra vida y tenemos que pensar qué va a pasar después de que nos retiremos. ¿Cómo vamos a hacer y cómo vamos a aspirar a conformar una familia también? Y esto también nos lo da el deporte, porque al final nos da ese corazón de guerreros para poder estar luchando. Entonces, ahorita lo que yo hago acá en México es estar presente en las asambleas, de pronto alzar la voz, estar presente en este tipo de foros, estar presente en muchos colectivos en México. Recientemente, por ejemplo, hablando de medios, siempre que tengo la oportunidad de ser entrevistado, pues claro que alzo la voz en favor de la comunidad LGBT y por supuesto la comunidad trans, ¿no? En el deporte. Y la pregunta es, efectivamente, como bien dice Vero, si todas las personas trans activas pasan todos los requisitos que te pide una federación internacional, la pregunta es, ¿por qué no dejarles competir? Efectivamente, se someten a controles de dopaje, se someten a controles de esfuerzo, a todo como debe de ser un atleta de alto rendimiento. Y lo que no entienden es que nosotros como trans no somos tramposos, sabemos las reglas del juego y por eso entramos a esto. Y por tal suerte nosotros estamos dispuestos porque es lo que amamos hacer. Si nos piden que las reglas del juego es ese, se cumplen, pero del otro lado de pronto no hay respuesta. Y eso es lo que de pronto digo en medios. Ahora que fueron los Juegos Olímpicos de Tokio 2020, una televisora importante de acá de México que es Televisa, me llama para ser especialista de taekwondo en los Juegos Olímpicos. Créanme, para mí fue un gran honor que tuve tener esta invitación, porque mi deporte en mi país es sumamente practicado y ha habido muchas personas también sumamente destacadas, tanto hoy como ayer, ¿no? Y de todos ellos que ya están retirados, dijeron, elijo a Ricardo. Y yo dije, wow, pero mi labor, ¿saben cuál fue? Es cuidar mucho el cómo se da el mensaje, porque yo no iba a dar una clase de sexualidad en la televisión, yo iba a narrar peleas, ¿no? Sin embargo, sí para mí era muy importante que me presentaran como mi vida anterior y como la vida actual, para sensibilizar a una sociedad de que deben de ser respetuosos con las decisiones de cada quien. Hicieron una cápsula sumamente cuidada, de hecho, 2 semanas antes que se diera al aire, me la mostraron y realmente hicieron un trabajo sumamente cuidadoso y muy respetuoso. Entonces, algo que yo he adoptado hoy en día es, entiendo que a veces vamos contracorriente, pero nosotros debemos ser maestros o maestras de mucha gente que no entiende que el derecho y el respeto se tiene que exigir. Si yo no te afecto, tú no me afectes. Y de una manera lo más, cuando hay oportunidades como esta, lo más hablado, lo más alto posible decir, ¿sabes qué? Yo soy un hombre orgullosamente trans y tengo conocimientos y ¿sabes qué? No tienes por qué dejarme a un lado. Para mí fue una experiencia muy buena el hecho de que en Televisa me dieran esta oportunidad y así como lo han hecho en diferentes medios de México. Hoy en día también soy consejero en un periódico muy importante en México que se llama Reforma en donde nosotros decidimos como consejo qué notas periodísticas deportivas se deben de tomar atención. Y por supuesto les digo, oigan, viene este caso, viene el tema, viene el mes del Pride, vamos a darles, no nada más en el mes, viene el caso de Laurel Hubbard, vamos a tratar con cuidado esas notas. En fin, es una manera también de poderles educar, de poderles sensibilizar, que al final de cuentas una sociedad que no tiene información y lo más sencillo es simplemente señalar o agarrar el teléfono y comentar cosas horribles en las redes sociales sin siquiera tener información o simplemente ignorancia, ¿no? Entonces, para cerrar mi pregunta hago un llamado para que realmente todos los presidentes, todos los que están dirigiendo los deportes de cualquier parte del mundo, realmente sean sensibles en este tema, porque estás tratando con seres humanos que realmente tienen todo un proceso atrás y que cuando llegamos a ellos, pues es porque ya se pasó todo un camino, empezando por aceptarnos a nosotros mismos, que no nacimos con el cuerpo que nos corresponde, simplemente con una identidad y con una sensación de que debemos ser congruentes con lo que hacemos y con lo que decimos y cómo nos vemos. Entonces, esa sería mi participación.
Thank you so much, Ricky. Okay, Chris, next question is for you. So your website, transathlete.com, has really become a go-to resource and almost like an encyclopedia for all the trans inclusion policies that exist around the world. So can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to develop transathlete.com? Why was it important, and how has some of the work you've done over the past, especially 5 years, evolved?
Yeah, definitely. So, it's interesting hearing the other panelists, and I'm so grateful to share space with everyone here today. In that first question about our experience of being trans in sport, and I realized in hearing, other people's answers to this, that my answer to this is very edited in terms of how I speak about my experience now. And I think part of that is a defense mechanism of, living an out life as a trans man for the last 11 years in sport, and realizing that there was a lot of pain and there exists a lot of pain. And, Veronica said that this is an emotional answer that really, I cannot separate my identity as an athlete from my identity as a person who is trans. And so I carry with me in every space my trans identity. Regardless of if I enter a space as a man, I'm still a man of trans experience. And it was really out of my own experience of transitioning in sport that I realized that there was an opportunity to create a resource like transathlete.com, because I didn't see anything like that out there when I was looking for information about trans people in sport, about policies, about what it might potentially be like for me as an out trans man to participate in the men's category. And so in doing my research, in coming out, I had to out myself to my national governing body, to race organizers, to local organizers, and to World Federation in order to get my category changed to participate in the men's category. And at that time, there weren't policies in my sports. And it was a really challenging, painful process of having to defend my own humanity, of having to defend my right to participate in sport as the person that I know that I am. And so really it was in doing that process and in experiencing that pain of having to out myself, of feeling less than, or like I was not welcomed or wanted in sport at that time, that I really wanted to create this resource so that other people knew that policies did exist, and also to use it as a tool to leverage policy change. So one of the coolest things about transathlete.com is that since 2013, when I launched it as a hub of just the existing policies at that time, we've seen so many more policies be introduced, and then also existing policies change and evolve and get better for trans athletes based on the presence of other policies. And so it's really a tool not only for trans people in sport to see if there's a policy in their sport, but if there's not, I've been contacted by countless athletes who have told me that there isn't a policy in their sport, in their national governing body, in their state, whatever level of play that they're at. And I've been able to work with those athletes and those organizers to help create policies. So it's been a really rewarding opportunity. Much of this was rooted in my own personal experience and pain, but also recognizing that, my experience is very different than Patricio's, and is very different than Veronica's, and is very different than Ricky internationally. And so there are so many parts about sexism and racism that have played into my ability to have a platform. And I wanted to use that opportunity to highlight some of the issues with policies, the fact that I have been treated, with much less discrimination than any of my peers who are trans women who just want to participate in sports. And it doesn't matter if I'm achieving success, I'm still faced with less discrimination, less harassment, and because I am a white trans man. And that I can't separate that from my experience. And so, one of the things is that most of these policies that do exist in the sports world disproportionately impact trans women and regulate the bodies of trans women and non-binary people, and also disproportionately impact Black, Brown, and Indigenous athletes, and particularly athletes from the global South. And that has to be called out and stated. It has to be recognized in policy. And transathlete.com is a tool to identify that, to work to change that, and to help athletes, coaches, administrators, national governing bodies get an understanding and a basic education about the participation of trans people in sport.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. And there are a few things that I've been hearing from you all that I just want to surface. And I think as we hold both this conversation about inclusive policies in one hand, it's equally as important that we're talking about trans folks as actual human beings on the other side. And so I think, Chris, when you're talking about your own experience in creating Trans Athlete and really understanding that we need to be able to hold both this policy conversation and also understand the incredibly diverse lived experiences of trans folks around the world, I think is really significant and really important to this conversation. And acknowledging the fact that the majority of policies governing the participation of trans athletes have been made by people from the global North who are, for the most part, cisgender, heterosexual, white men. And also being able to name that even in the creation of policy itself, the structural and systemic racism and oppression, just even picking apart some of those policies. Okay, so next question is for everyone, and Veronica, we'll start with you on this one. What advice or thoughts do you have for sport governing bodies, for international federations, many of whom are watching this panel right now, trying to create inclusive policies for athletes?
Yeah, so I'll try and keep this short, but I mean, this is sort of what I do for a living, is answer this question. I have published research on this very topic that, interested viewers can go look at, or if they want copies, they can email me. I have a lot to say. So first, the biggest problem I see is the debate seems to be focused around placing on one side fairness and on the other side inclusion, as if those are in opposition to each other. And the fact is they are not. The truth is that fairness requires inclusion. Right. It is a demand of fairness to be fully inclusive and to not discriminate. So these ideas we have of, especially as Chris noted, it's disproportionately focused on trans women, this question of fairness, that this idea that we must ban or limit trans women because if we don't, then they will somehow take over women's sport. And then they use the language that it will destroy women's sport, and that trans women are somehow taking something away from otherwise deserving cisgender women. Well, we have to remember that immediately places trans women as not real women. And socially, medically, in every sense that matters, we are real women. Trans men are real men. Non-binary people are actually non-binary. So the humanity of who we are and what we are needs to be at front and center at all times. So you can't do the policy debate without facts, and the facts are that trans women are real women. So if you're looking to exclude certain women because of certain advantages, then you have to apply that equally, and that's not done, nor should it be, but it's not done equally. So for example, the trans women and intersex women have a testosterone limit of 10 animals per liter, but some cisgender women are naturally above that level, but they never get tested. So it's not as if all women are being tested and subject to the same policy. It's singling out trans and intersex women. And how do we single them out if they are not out trans or intersex people? Well, it's who doesn't look feminine enough. And it is not a coincidence that it is women of color from the global south that are disproportionately singled out as not looking feminine enough, because our social standards of femininity are based on white women's femininity. And so this is an issue of global justice and racial justice. The other thing is that when people are taking on these policy discussions, they're usually thinking of it from a position of defensiveness. Like, how can we defend including trans people from people who hate trans people? So if you're worried about your policy position from one of what will transphobic people say to us, you're already off to a bad start. You should be thinking about what is right and what is just, not what can we defend from people who will send us hateful messages. And the fact is, you're generally working from examples. You have examples of trans athletes and you're worried about us. So who are the examples of trans athletes succeeding in world sport? Well, you have, say, Laurel Hubbard, who did not win an Olympic medal. She was one of the first trans athletes ever to compete at the Olympics, and 2021 Tokyo was the first time trans athletes have ever competed. So since the 2003 IOC recommendation openly allowing trans athletes to compete, that was over 54,000 Olympians, and not a single trans athlete was able to participate, let alone win a medal. So we still haven't had a trans woman win an Olympic medal. The first trans athlete to win an Olympic medal was Quinn from the Canadian women's soccer team, who is non-binary. But people are not clamoring to have them banned. People are clamoring to have people like Laurel Hubbard banned. The other example is me. I've never been to an Olympics. I've never been to an elite world championships. I win age group masters world championships. And also I lose most of my races at those events. The 2 masters world championships I've done, I've had 4th and 1st and a 2nd and a 1st. And so particularly in the last one, the 2019 Masters World Championships in Manchester, I came 2nd and 1st, and the person who won the event that I came second in the event that I won. So both of us got a gold and a silver against each other in the 2 events. And yet the media reporting is about me dominating the world championships. And so this language of trans women dominating is nonsense. Just please, I implore you, look at the actual facts. There has not yet been a single trans woman Olympic medalist. There has not been a single trans woman elite world champion. No trans woman holds an elite world record. The fact is, we are roughly 0.3% of the world population. We are statistically underrepresented in elite sport. So the idea that you need to craft policies to restrict our access is against the very facts. We are already restricted, right? We already have barriers. And then the final thing is that if what you're really concerned about fairness as having like no competitive advantage, that is nonsense in sport. That doesn't exist. If you look at the range of body types within women, for example, it is huge. And we let really tall people compete against really short people in sports that select for tallness, like high jump. So in the 2016 Rio Olympic final for the women's high jump, for example, the tallest woman in the athlete was over 6'3" and she won gold, and 10th place was 5'5". So that's a 10.5-inch difference between 1st and 10th place. And we call that fair. And yeah, fine, call that fair, but then don't single out trans women or intersex women. And one more thing, the World Athletics justification for banning hyperandrogenic, high testosterone women, intersex women from the 1500 meter event and the mile was not based on any scientific data that they had an advantage. In fact, they admitted that their scientific data suggested a disadvantage for having higher testosterone. The World Athletics explicit justification for banning hyperandrogenic intersex women from that event is that there were too many successful hyperandrogenic women in that event. And that is the most explicit case of discrimination I've ever seen in sport. There are too many of you succeeding, even though we don't have any evidence of advantage, therefore you're banned from this event. That is not what sport is about, but that is what sport policy looks like right now, with federations like World Athletics leading the way. So don't follow.
Thank you, Veronica. So Patricio, will go to you next, and then Chris, and then we'll end with Ricky for this question.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of advice I have around policy, I'm going to be honest, like I'm suspicious of policy. I'm suspicious of laws that get woven together in the name of fairness or inclusion or any of these type of things. But laws have never protected anyone in terms of dealing with a direct violence, whether it be anti-Black, whether it be homophobic. These things, like, yes, they do help in some way of like having some framework, but unless the culture changes, the policy has no teeth. This doesn't matter. You know, what I would like to see in addition to the creation of these policies, which I understand in the world where laws are needed, even if I wish there was I dream of a world where laws weren't needed and that we didn't need someone to dictate what is fair for us in these type of manners. I really want also legislation to be not the only thing we fixate on, like how do we change the culture? I, for example, am allowed to compete because policy allows me. I have trouble finding opponents. I can't force someone, nor would I ever want to force someone, because I really, really believe in consent as a value. But how do we create a culture where trans athletes are seen as athletes, where they're not having to contend with, even if there's a policy that says they can come and compete, they aren't receiving death threats. They aren't having stalkers. They aren't being harassed all the time. This isn't enough. Policy is not enough. If you have the power as an organization to actually start creating cultural change within the top of the organization down, you need to do this. It's not enough. We need more than just policy that will allow people to compete, because people manipulate policy, people change policy, people fight policy. This is going to consistently happen. But if we can change the culture, there won't be a need for those policies anymore. And I really just want to leave anyone who has any thoughts or feelings around like, how do we actually have inclusion? I want you to reframe the question. We're often taught or asked, what do trans people lose when we aren't included in sports? We know exactly who I am as a person would be lost if I didn't have sport. I want to turn that around the other way and ask you, what will sports lose if trans people aren't included? I think that's really important, and that should be the question every person who has any sort of power whatsoever, and I would argue we all have power. Don't think that you have to be only part of an organization to have power. We all have collective power to change culture. But I want every single person listening to this to really think about, what will sports lose if we exclude certain people from being able to be involved?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Patricio. Chris, over to you.
So I think that Patricio and Veronica have summed this up very well, and I would echo a lot of what they would say. So I'll take this in a different approach. First, I would say, the primary thing that people need to remember is trans people are people, and that there's not just one way to be a trans man. There's not just one way to be a trans woman. There's not just one way to be a cisgender woman or a cisgender man either. And so we really need to expand our thinking about humans in general, and stop trying to put people into boxes. Now, in our binary system of sports, this is incredibly difficult. And this is where our policymaking comes into play. And I would encourage people to, every sport should have a pathway for participation for transgender athletes, not a reason to exclude them. And so if you are in a position where you do not yet have a policy, the time is long overdue to create a pathway for trans and non-binary people to have access to your sport in a safe way, in a way that that preserves their human dignity and their rights. And I would say, don't just copy and paste from another policy that's out there right now, because there are many policies that are not good, that are not inclusive, that do not support the human rights of athletes, of all athletes. And so make sure that you have trans and non-binary people at the table when you are creating these policies. And just, keep in mind that not every trans person, not every transgender athlete wants to be an athlete activist. We come to sport because we are athletes, and you are joined today by a group of incredible people who have used sport and their identity as a way to create social change. It's something that we all take pride in here on this panel today. But not every athlete wants to do that, and it should not be the responsibility of every transgender person to fight for their own rights in sport. That should be national governing bodies, leagues, teams, and organizations need to be creating those pathways so that we don't have to defend our own humanity. We can focus on what's truly important, which is our training, our racing, our competing, and our participation in sport.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. All right, Ricky, take us home on this question.
Wow, pues qué digo, ya dijeron todos mis compañeros prácticamente cosas importantísimas. Aquí simplemente tomo muchísimo la frase de Chris, se tiene que hacer reglas a la medida, un traje a la medida. Y que efectivamente se está hablando de personas, de humanos, que deseamos trascender en muchísimas cosas. Necesitamos reglas claras, porque creo que los que menos queremos hacer trampa somos las personas trans para que estemos aceptados en un deporte que nos corresponde como derecho humano, ¿no? Simplemente que si consideren que tenemos ese derecho de participar, de defender, de ser alguien importante en nuestros deportes, de ser ejemplo de muchas personas de superación, de ser valientes, de atrevernos a realmente vivirnos nosotros mismos como nos corresponde y como nos identificamos, porque eso es realmente lo que nosotros queremos, simplemente vivir en plenitud en ese aspecto y más en el deporte. Entonces yo los dejo sobre la mesa, seamos realmente sensibles, seamos realmente congruentes y seamos respetuosos, porque vuelvo a repetir, estamos hablando de humanos, no de otra cosa. Y los humanos tenemos derechos. Así es que, vaya, hay que poner las reglas. Esas son las reglas que se ponen. Ah, perfecto, va. Entramos. ¿Por qué? Porque somos gente de retos. Y eso es algo que, pues, lo tenemos desde que nacimos. Así es que les pido de favor lo consideren y que sean realmente empáticos con toda la sociedad y la comunidad LGBT y en especial la comunidad trans.
Thank you so much, Ricky. And, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we have one more question. We can do one sentence or less. We have covered a lot of ground in this panel. So I would love if each of you could leave folks watching with one sentence, one takeaway that you want everybody to think about. And let's go in reverse order this time. Ricky, do you want to start?
Ahora me dejaste la pelota a mí. Ok, va. Vamos con todo. Bien, vive y deja vivir y sé pleno en la vida.
Transgender people play sports for the same reasons as anybody else. It's because of our love of the game, the way we love to challenge ourselves, to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, to find community and our own sense of self. And every person should have the opportunity to participate in sports.
despite what some people think around the changes in media and the medical technology making us more visible, trans people are ancient. We have always been a part of a society. We have always been a part of humankind, and nothing is going to stop us. Nothing has. No systematic efforts to erase us have been successful. So if we understand there is no way to deny that we exist, that we are a part of this world, let's fully embrace and bring us back into the communities, into our rightful places.
Fairness and inclusion are not in opposition to each other. Fairness requires inclusion. We are currently suspicious of exceptional women, and we celebrate exceptional men. And I dream for a day that we will celebrate exceptional women, whether cis, trans, or intersex.
Oof. Thank you all so, so much. This has been such a tremendously powerful panel. And thank you for sharing your time, your hearts, your energy, your expertise with all of us, with me. I'm tremendously grateful for each and every one of you. Please carry on the conversation on the Sporting Chance Forum 2021 website and on social media using the hashtag SCF21. We're looking forward to seeing you live at the session Sex and Gender in Sport Policy, a Human Rights Perspective on October 4th at 1600 CET. Thank you again so much, everybody.